So we'll get started. Thank you everybody for joining us. You're very welcome tonight to Clay Arts Centre. We're here with Vinnie Bagwell, who is going to share her career with us, and plenty of images. And she's a great storyteller as well. So we're going to really enjoy ourselves tonight. I won't keep you too much longer. We're going to listen to Vinnie tonight. She's going to share her career with us. Vinnie is Yonkers born, Yonkers, New York, born and raised, and is back in Yonkers again, where she is living full time. We were just talking about how nice it is to live near the water before we went live. So I will hand it over to Vinnie. Whenever you're ready, Vinnie, you can start sharing.
Hi there. So I'm going to whip through this so that we have time to talk with folks that are visiting. Share. Okay. So hi, I am Vinnie Bagwell, and I am what is called a public artist, which is a little different than a curatorial art. I basically compete for a living, and so it begins with storytelling. I am a storyteller. If you know me, I've got lots of stories all the time. And it's so funny that I have become a historian type artist because when I was younger, I didn't really care so much about history. But as time went on, I began to realize that history is the memory of people. And so I like to consider myself a creative steward of our nation's memory. This is the piano lesson by August Wilson. It was at the Signature Theater back in 2012. Ruben Santiago Hudson, who just did Ma Rainey, called me up one day and said, I think I want you to make my piano. And I said, I think I know what you want. So for the most part, I am creating public art that conveys the unvarnished truth. This is a very interesting time in public art because now, since Black Lives Matter, I'm getting phone calls just about daily, people wanting to talk about creating new public artworks about the untold stories. So that's right up my alley because I'm interested in sharing the history of people of color. And of course, my style is anchored in naturalism. I used to say realism, but my daughter went to art school and she's like, no, Mom, it's naturalism. This is Ella Fitzgerald at the Yonkers train station. It is the first sculpture of a contemporary African-American woman to be commissioned by a municipality. Ironically, I began sculpting in 1993. And at that time, we didn't have the internet. So I couldn't figure out how to find public art commissions. So I created my own. My work is defined by candid portraiture. I'm not really trying to do what photographers call grip and grins. I'm trying to show people just being a regular person on a regular day. And so my work elevates the culture of marginalized people. Originally, I was just thinking that I want to do people of color, but as time went on, I had opportunities to do, well, people of color. So Native Americans, Hispanic Americans. This sculpture is Legacies, which is in Memphis, Tennessee. And so I do three-dimensional sculptures. This is Harriet Tubman and Thomas Garrett, who is an abolitionist in Delaware. And I like to move the narrative with bas relief. Interestingly enough, it is something that kind of came to me when I was working on the piece for Memphis. The budget was fixed and it was a big story. So the question was, how can I tell this whole story with one figure? And so this is when I realized, hey, I could just kind of create a surface and just create relief sculptures that are narrative that goes all the way around and makes people walk around it. That's a good idea, right? And so bas relief techniques have now become my signature. This is the back of the man in the arena, Teddy Roosevelt. So of course, most people know him as the president, but before he became the president, he was a he was a bunch of other things. At any rate, the goal is to employ montages, symbols, and text. This is a close-up of the piano. And again, I like to use Adinkra symbols and all kinds of things that people may or may not know. And the goal is to spark inquiry. Interestingly enough, I have a very large African following on social media, and they are always just tickled and intrigued that I'm using African symbols. I'm like, yeah, I know it seems to make sense to me, but sometimes they'd like to tell me what the symbol means. I'm like, yes, I know. At any rate, the goal is to, of course, create visual intrigue and to drive a story. If you know August Wilson's play, The Piano Lesson, the story is basically about a slave owner who sold a woman her child to be able to buy a piano. And then when his wife freaked out about him selling those two people because those were her favorite people, he went to the husband and asked the husband of the woman that he sold to please carve them on the piano so his wife could be happy. And this man decided to carve his whole family history all over the piano. So that's the theory on this particular artwork. For me, the details matter. I want things to be clear, legible, readable. And so I pay tremendous attention to details, facial expressions, body language. All of these things matter to convey the spirit, line, texture. All of this is for visual intrigue. And so over the years, the feedback that I get from people, we seem to agree that my subjects have souls. This is six. This is my sixth sculpture in the first 6 months of sculpting. By that time, I was realizing that I can kind of do what I want to do. The question is, what do I want to do? And so the goal is to create work that speaks to the viewer. And they are meant to be engaging. It's not uncommon for people to send me pictures of them with Ella. This is actor Clayton LaBeouf. Many of you may recall him from The Wire and a variety of other things. These are his daughters who happen to live in the neighborhood. So he took a picture and said, hey, look where we are. And so I like to use natural stones for pedestals, boulders, I like rocks. Just like stones for visual texture. And I also like to use incised text and granite and graphic design and things like that. Again, this is all to create intimacy with the viewer. It's not enough for people to walk by my work and say, oh, that's nice. I want them to engage it. And so I give them reasons to look. Began sculpting, my goodness, in 1993. It's been a long time. This is my very first sculpture. I made it in 4 days. And interestingly enough, we tried mold making. A friend of mine, her husband was a part of, he was the one that introduced me to the idea of sculpting. And this sculpture got caught in the mold for 3 days. As you can see, her ears got clipped off and she kind of went through the fire, and of course I was hysterical because I'm like, I can't destroy my first sculpture before I even finish making it. So luckily she survived. And then I guess about 2 years ago, I decided to actually cast her because I realized that I had her all this time. It's like, you should go ahead and cast her in bronze like you thought you would. So I proposed my first public art work to the city of Yonkers in 1995. At that time, I was a newspaper columnist. I write for a living. Of course, now I do grant proposals and things like that. But at that time, I was writing for the newspaper for Gannett. And I wanted very badly to do a big one. And so, of course, they said yes. One of the things that I began doing from the very beginning was civic engagement. I wanted art students, people that had as much talent as I had at their age, to be exposed to sculpture and public art because it's not in the curriculum. To this day, it's still not in the curriculum. And, my idea was, how do you know that there's even a such thing as public art if nobody exposes it to you, if nobody tells you how to do it, if you don't have an opportunity? I often think, who would I be if I had started sculpting at 16 rather than 36? So I want to talk about the Enslaved Africans Rain Garden. This is a model in community building. Oftentimes when you write proposals, one of the questions they'll ask you is, is this a model? And it's like, yeah, this could be duplicated over and over and over and over. And so the interesting thing is that we began talking about this back in 2009. That's Patricia McDowell, who at the time was the majority leader for the city council for the city of Yonkers. And she came to me and said, I want to celebrate the enslaved Africans. And of course, my question was, well, do you have any money? And she's like, no, but I know where we can start. And so lo and behold, we started piecing together the funding to do this project. Entergy and Metro Partners kicked off the corporate contributions. Entergy gave me funding for the student workshops, and Metro Partners gave me 5 months of free rent. The Yonkers African American Heritage Committee was willing to be a fiscal administrator. What you will find if you've never done public art or you've never done grant writing before, oftentimes you cannot get a grant if you're an individual. It has to be, kind of ferreted through a fiscal administrator, someone who has a 501c3 nonprofit, because it's tax-exempt money. And so at that point, civic engagement became the keystone in my practice. I mean, I've been doing it from day one. So I had historical symposiums. I had exhibitions that traveled. I did artist talks, started inviting strange people into my home, which is also where I work, having parties, again, hundreds of people parading through my house, looking at my artwork and being exposed to a working artist. And so it was important to me to hear the community's voice. It was important to me that what I thought mattered to the community. I'm very adamant about that. I believe in putting the public in public art. Public art is for the community. It represents the value of that community. So certainly they should have some say about it before it goes in the ground, not after. So the city of Yonkers matched the funding that I found. I found $50,000, and they matched it with a community development block grant from HUD. It's interesting because the interesting thing about CDBG funding is that it depends on where you are. So for instance, Yonkers at the time that we started this had a 12% poverty rate in the Southwest quadrant, which is the part where I live and the part that I serve. And so it's interesting because I'm working on a project now in upstate New York, and everything is different because the demographic is different. So it's interesting learning about funding from the federal government. Arts Westchester CEO Janet Langston became an advisor and a fiscal administrator. I call her Godmommy because I said to her, I need somebody to help me take care of this project. I have 5 sculptures, 5 babies. I need all of them to be viable, and I need them to come to fruition, and I need somebody smarter than me to help me do this. And so Janet held my hand for quite some time, just helping me get through funding of this project, because unlike most projects, rather than having to compete, I created this from scratch. So interestingly enough, I was outside sculpting one day. At the time I lived at 66 Main in Yonkers, which has a roof deck, and the building was brand new. So I was the only person on the 9th floor. And so I acted like the 9th floor was all mine. So the roof deck, the kitchen, the big screen TV, and the community, all that was mine. And so a gentleman, Michael Pila, happened to catch me sculpting one day. And he's like, I'd like to talk to you about your web presence. And I was like, And so I said, well, I don't really have any money for that. But he said, well, I'd like to give it as an in-kind service, because I think that, thousands of people are going to learn about this project. And in that process, they're going to learn about me. So he created my website. And then, of course, in 2009, Facebook was pretty much brand new. And I began to realize how important social media was going to be for a project like this. And so I began inviting people to watch me. So friends, fans, and followers from all over the world were watching as this project began to unfold. And it was really, really interesting when people from other countries that don't speak English wanted to talk at length. This is before Facebook actually had a translator. It's like you got to cut, paste. Okay, what did he say? Oh, okay, let me answer now. Translate now, cut, paste, put it back. Of course, now it's much friendlier than that. But I remember the first time someone from Japan, not speaking English, wanted to talk about art. Somebody from Lithuania. I'm like, Russia, is that okay? At any rate, the point is that social media has become so important to all of us. And it's also changed the art game. That's a whole nother conversation. And so talking to people about the details as they unfolded. So it's kind of like the Vinnie show. It's like, let's see what she's doing now. Oh, look, she's doing wax. And so again, a lot of people had never been able to witness art, bronze, being, well, in process. So it's like, wait a minute, you got to cast it in wax first? Like, yeah, let me explain why. And so it became very intriguing for a lot of people, and they learned about the creative process and how I think and, decision making, and then all kinds of things. So you notice, for instance, I use Braille. I had to explain to people I am legally blind. For real, for real. Hi, look, look, look. Look at this. Can you see me? Mr. Magoo glasses, okay? So point of it is that I went to a visual handicap class from grades 1 through 4 in the Yonkers school system. I was one of 2 kids in the same grade. There were a total of 6 of us. And my little girlfriend who was in my grade, Susan Green was actually blind. So I had to wait my turn because she was learning Braille while I was learning to read. So I learned how to read Braille at the same time I was learning how to read. And as I became a sculptor, I thought it was kind of cool that Braille looks like scarification, like how Africans embellish their skins with markings. And I'm thinking, I think it's really cool that somebody can touch that and read it and it has meaning for them. So these days I incorporate Braille into almost all of my public artworks. And so, people begin to learn about the importance of preserving local history. Even now, it's not uncommon for the media to call me and want to talk on the phone and interview, and they want to know, now that Black Lives Matter, what should people be thinking about putting into the ground now that we're removing these offensive sculptures? And I'm saying local history. You can do Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass and all the icons. That's marvelous. But I think it's even more interesting when you identify people in your community that have made contributions to enriching your community, making your community what it is, giving it the color and the flavor and, the identity. I think that's what's interesting about public art now, that, you can talk about the untold stories. And so at the time, a lot of people had not heard about rain gardens. They didn't know what the heck is a rain garden. I had lived in Maryland for 10 years where rain gardens are pretty plentiful. And, basically it is a garden that is designed to be self-sustaining by the rain. So Con Edison, which is my utility company here in New York, they funded the inaugural exhibition. And so we had this giant party at Arts Westchester. It was really marvelous. And 300 some odd people showed up. It was like a love fest, squealing and selfieing and hugging and kissing and, talking and just, learning about this particular project and why it was important. And so New York State did my text boards for me. They had done a exhibition a number of years earlier about slavery in New York. And that's another talk show from the standpoint of a lot of people don't realize that New York was doing what New York does. We were financing slavery. We were insuring the ships. We were funding stuff, economic development. This is what slavery is all about. And so there was this marvelous exhibition about the history of slavery in New York. And a lot of people were really, really very surprised because a lot of people don't know that. And so this is the opening reception. We're talking about, the whole process of getting that far. I created 5 maquettes to show people what I wanted to do. When I was talking to the city of Yonkers, I said, it's important that they be museum quality because I'm going to want to exhibit them in a museum. So I cast 5 bronzes. And then it's really funny how people show up in your world. I get a phone call one day from a man named Ty Grayell, and we start talking. I'm like, oh my God, you have got to work with me on this. So I commissioned Ty Grayell to create 5 stories. It's like, my goal is to humanize the memory of enslaved people. It is easy to not care about people when you think of them as other. I mean, my goodness, we just saw this with the children, from Mexico. They put them in cages and separate them from their families and all kinds of craziness. And this is because they thought of them as other. It's like, no, we're all people. Black people are people too. And so in the process of humanizing enslaved Africans, the sculptures have names. There's Isati, Bibi, Temba the Boatman, the children, Shola and Alumide. And so, I asked Ty, I said, can you create stories? Tell me who these people were before they were enslaved, okay? Keyword, enslaved. These are Africans. They're not slaves. They're Africans that were enslaved. Tell me about their life before, during, and after being enslaved. And so Ty is a phenomenal storyteller. If you'd like to hear those stories, by all means, please go to YouTube, look for me, and then scroll down and look for the Enslaved Africans Rain Garden. All 5 stories are on YouTube. You can find them very easily. So we did the second exhibition in 2012 at the Hudson River Museum. And again, the idea was to keep these sculptures in the public eye, to make people understand that, this is a goal, to be able to create a sculpture garden to celebrate enslaved Africans, because at that time there were no major public art installations about enslaved Africans as a group. Of course, you have the African Burial Ground in Manhattan, which is a phenomenal destination. But if you know the history of that place, the GSA was building a building, and they're digging the foundation, and coincidentally the construction company that was doing the excavation was a Black construction company, and they're coming across remains, and the general contractor saying, keep going, that's normal. And of course, as time went on, they started coming across artifacts, and they realized, hey, wait, these are enslaved Africans. So of course they spoke to the mayor, who at that time was David Dinkins, coincidentally my cousin. And then of course the folks from Harlem and Brooklyn and all over started protesting, like, whoa, stop, wait. And so that became somewhat of a political football, but at the back end, we did get a very nice installation and a museum out of it. But again, site specific. I'm talking about the rest of the enslaved Africans for the rest of the country. It's like, where are the monuments for that? And so this is, was the goal for this particular project. So in 2014, we had another exhibition. Again, the exhibition is traveling. It's like I wanted to travel all over. And each year we had to create funding in order to facilitate this. So in 2014, it was exhibited at the Phillips Manor Hall Historic Site in Yonkers. Most people, again, do not know that Frederick Phillips, who was the builder of this manor, which is now almost 400 years old, he was the largest slave trader in the country, second to the people in South Carolina. And again, most people are not thinking that New York is that big when it comes to the history of slavery. But again, we're going way back. We're going to the back end of the 1600s, 1685 to 1695. Most of the time when people think of slavery, they're thinking like the 1800s. I'm going back further, before the Europeans came, when nobody was here. This guy was a boat builder for the West India Company, and he married up. And I imagine that one day he and his wife sitting there having a chat, and she's like, why don't we just do our own slave trade? So they did for 10 years. And it's just a phenomenal story. Meanwhile, what a lot of people don't know is that John Jay, most people know John Jay in New York because there's John Jay College, but John Jay also was the first Chief Justice for the Supreme Court in the United States of America. John Jay was the first one to write a law to try to free the enslaved Africans. Ultimately, he wrote the first law to manumit them. And again, this is free them by law. And of course, things progressed from there. This is 64 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's what makes this project so important, because this is not information that you regularly find. It's not in the curriculum. Most people don't know it. And so I said, this is a good story. And, people will walk into this installation and come out with information that they might not normally be able to find or know. So in 2016, phase 2 began, enlargements. Again, New York State funded the first sculpture. And this is Isati. And at that point, I started developing partners. So my first partner was Sarah Lawrence College, because they're right here in Yonkers, borderline on Bronxville. And Sarah Lawrence College, if you know anything about it, is a very creative oriented college. They don't have majors there. It's just very, very, very fluid. And so they thought that this would be an extraordinary project for them to bring their students to, because again, they too do not have a sculpture curriculum. So the entity again funded these workshops, and we used to have these really great get-togethers to talk about history as well as the creation of large-scale public art. Elizabeth Seton University, the School of Business, came to me and volunteered to do a business plan, and these chicks did a phenomenal job. They gave me a business plan that actually was practical. And so professional photographers, I am a big advocate for, if you have a project, hire a photographer. Of course, now, we have, we got iPhone 11, 12, whatever. You got the Samsung. You can make some very great photographs on your phone. It's true. But frankly, I'm an advocate for professional documentation, because you never know what you're going to want to do with the photography. You may want to do a book. You may want to do an online exhibition. You may want to do, there's a lot of things you might want to do with your documentation, but it's good to have high quality documentation. In studio visitors, I honestly, if you look like you're not a serial killer, I'll invite you into my house. Come on in, let me show you around. Children, I think it's important to expose children to art, because most children are artists. And so civic engagement also includes previews, inviting people to come into the studio to see the sculpture while I'm making it and before I actually send it off to cast. I would rather hear criticism before than afterwards. I don't want to hear anything else afterwards. Tell me before. So, of course, this became quite political. So I'm inviting all of my politicians. That's my assemblywoman, Shelley Meyer, and my senator, who's now majority leader for New York State, Andrea Stewart Cousins, and her right-hand person, Simra Brandon, and Connie Fowler is, at the time, she was a commissioner for the Human Rights Commission. And so again, anybody who was anybody, it's like, come see the sculpture. So the second sculpture was Temple the Boatman. And again, City of Yonkers matched the NISCA grant to enlarge the second sculpture. The thing about the fact that there are 5 of them is that, once I completed them, I was like, I don't want them to go into storage. I want people to be able to see them. So, again, inviting students in to see the work in progress. Luckily for me, the Yonkers Hawthorne Pearls 5th graders are not far from where my studio is. And they were just delighted. The Board of Education, like, oh my God, this is the kind of enrichment that we want. And so usually we'd have like 60 kids parade through, like 20, 20, and 20. Luckily the neighborhood is interesting enough that they could have 40 walk around the neighborhood while the 20 were in the studio. So there's the library where the sculptures are, there's Phillips Manor Hall, there's the river, there's the site, so there's Ella, so that worked out wonderfully. And again, we're teaching tolerance and civility. I lived in Maryland for 10 years where it's a curriculum. If you're thinking about civility for your town, Google civility and let's see, Howard County, Maryland, it'll come up. whole thing from grades K through 12. This is something that we really need to teach. I mean, what we've been through, let's just talk about the last 4 years, the last year, whatever the case, maybe civility and tolerance is something that needs to be incorporated into the school system. When we moved to Maryland, my daughter was in 3rd grade. In 3rd grade, civility meant bonding with senior citizens. So every week for the whole year, once a week, they would go and read to senior citizens. If you're in kindergarten, it's about not littering and keeping your home clean. So every year they've got, a theme for teaching tolerance and civility, and I'm an advocate for that. So ultimately, when the sculptures were cast, we had a preview of the first 2 at the Yonkers Riverfront Library. They are still there. If you're close by, you walk in, they're right there when you get into the atrium. We just finished the children. The National Endowment for the Arts gave 2 grants to be able to create and cast the children. So this is Shola and Alumi Day. And then, of course, again, the previews were sponsored. This is my studio, and this particular preview of the children was sponsored by the Yonkers Human Rights Commission. I give really great parties. I believe in food. So Westchester County is funding construction as we speak. Pandemic slowed us down. We were wanting very much to do construction last year, but again, you notice that circle in the middle. Behind that circle, that's a building. That all that space is a building, and so the circle is the driveway. And there's a sculpture garden to the left, which is known as the Stone Meadow. And then there's going to be the rain garden, which is adjacent to that. So Bryce Turner is the architect that I work with for the most part. He and I worked for the first time in 2004. I was a competitor for Central Park for the northwest corner, Frederick Douglass. And I did not win. However, the sculpture was purchased by the Frederick Douglass Museum and Cultural Center in Highland Beach. As a matter of fact, they called last week to say that they decided that they want to put a life-size sculpture of Frederick Douglass, his son, and his daughter-in-law on the front lawn. If you're not familiar with that particular museum, it is on, across the street from the beach, overlooking the bay in Maryland. And the idea was originally that land in that area was owned by white people, of course, and Black people were prohibited from going to the beach. And the man who owned the land, when he died, he left it to his wife. And when his wife died, she left a note in her will that said that the land could only be purchased by Black people. So Highland Beach for a very long time was a predominantly Black affluent community. Of course, now, people are selling, it's integrated. But at the time, Frederick Douglass's son bought a plot of land and decided that he wanted to build his father a house so that he could sit literally on the deck and look across the bay to Talbot County, where he was enslaved as a free man at the end of his life. Unfortunately, Frederick Douglass had a heart attack and he didn't get a chance to live there, but it seems like a really cool story to put the sculptor Frederick Douglass and his son and his daughter on the front lawn, and then you can make the story up yourself. Like, he is literally looking across the bay. So I'm excited about that coming down the pike. Stay tuned. BCT Design they're master planners of cities worldwide. And this is an example of the kind of things they do. And it's just phenomenal. Normally, they don't do public art. Luckily for me, this is a friend of a friend. And I'm happy, very happy to be working with them. So again, they do architecture, they do interior design, they do environmental graphics, and they're passionate about pedestrian or oriented public spaces. So they're well versed in cultural and commercial amenities that accentuate public spaces. So these are the people who did the King of Prussia Mall. They did the Silver Spring Mall. There's a bunch of stuff that they've done that you may or may not know. And so our goal is to design truly memorable places. So this is the illustration that we used for the Rain Garden project. And the goal is to create spaces where inspiration and innovation converge. Originally, the rain garden was designed to be at the crown of the Yonkers daylighting. If you're familiar with Yonkers, right in front of the Yonkers train station, there is a faux river. Originally, it was, Lockern Plaza was a parking lot. And before it was a parking lot, it was a river. So they decided that they wanted to unearth the river. So back when Governor Pataki was running things, he set aside $42 million to create to unearth the original river. And so the interesting thing is that 42 million for a river, I just need about $1 million for public art for enslaved Africans. At any rate, we decided to move it, mostly because the previous mayor just allowed them to finish the design that they originally had. And so I said, well, frankly, I like it being down by the river because now I don't have to spend so much money. I can save about $1 million, for real though, because I had a faux river that I was creating. So now, we amended the design, and again, still trying to create it in a dramatic and exciting way. So this is the illustration of how it works. To the left is where the river is. And again, the idea is to give people an opportunity to walk through a very beautiful, lush garden. It still has a faux river that goes through it, but now it's a dry bed creek. And so, as I said, Westchester County is funding for spring 2021. We're supposed to break ground on May 1, and we're supposed to dedicate on June 19th. Stay tuned. So 2020 is the year of the woman and changing the narrative in public art. Last year was phenomenal in so many ways in the public art realm anyway. This is a sculpture that I made for Kentucky. Did not win, but I still love it. Sedona Truth is a commission that I won from the state of New York, Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Technically, the walkway connects to Poughkeepsie, but the sculpture actually is in Highland on the other side of the river. And so what was really interesting about this project is on the second day of pandemic, the governor's office called me and said, the governor would like to know if you're willing to work. And I'm like, yeah, definitely. And so they said, well, he wants to make you an essential business because, again, 2020 was the year of the woman. Sedona Truth was a very important figure during as an abolitionist and during, again, trying to emancipate enslaved Africans here in New York. She has a history in New York. And so he wanted that sculpture to come out on time. So I became an essential business. The really cool thing is I just started the enlargement and a Facebook friend turns out to be a 6th generation grandson. Evidently, Sedona Truth has a whole family of artists, people who paint, and these are good artists, and they're watching me, and I don't know that. And so it was really, really interesting because I get a phone call from, the grandson that says, I want to come over and visit. I'm like, sure, where are you coming from? He's like, Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm like, oh, so when are you coming to New York? He's like, Saturday. I'm like, this Saturday? He's like, yes. I'm like, but I just started. He said, I don't care. I want to see it. I was like, okay, well then, fine, come. But then that means you got to come back when I'm finished. Before I finish, you can see what it looks like. So he did. And so I can't tell you, what it was like becoming friends with Sedona Truth's family. This man, when he returned, actually stayed at my house and slept at the foot of the sculpture. He's got the picture. But, the point of it is that we became related, not just because I'm making a sculpture of his family member, but because we're artists, and that's how artists are, we're like a race of people. The real question is, who are you and what do you do? And so Sedona Truth came out on time. She was installed the day before the 100th anniversary of the women's suffrage at the walkway over the Hudson. As I said, she's on the Highland Beach side at the Welcome Center. And there's a second Sedona Truth, Meredith Bergman. Interesting enough, she and I used the same foundry and mold maker. She did the first sculpture of women in Central Park. And so after we finished installing and doing my unveiling, I raced an hour and a half south just to be able to see her sculpture on the first day of being installed. And I can't tell you, it's just such a cool thing to be able to do a public artwork for such a major holiday. Victory beyond Sims. All right, so 2 years ago, just about, I get wind of the fact that Mayor de Blasio and his wife, Shalane McRae, have decided to do public art as their legacy, which I was their biggest fan, like, yes, that's so cool. And so they announced that they were putting up $10 million to do public artworks in every borough about women of color. So I'm like, I want one of those. So of course, I applied for the first one, which was for Shirley Chisholm. I didn't even make finals. I was like, okay, fine, no problem. So when the second one came out for J. Marion Sims, like a lot of people, I'm like, who's he? And so I Googled and my jaw dropped. I mean, ladies, this is the guy, when you go get your pap smear and the thing that they put up your vagina, that guy. I'm like, and so turns out that this guy was experimenting on a dozen enslaved African women. That's part one. Part two is with no painkiller or anesthesia for like a number of years. They only know the name of 3 of them, so the other 9 are anonymous. When he finally gets his technique like down pat, he takes it to Europe and performs on white women with anesthesia and painkiller. And so the folks of Harlem and East Harlem's like, you know what, that sculpture got to come down now. Now turned into 10 years, a 10-year fight to get a sculpture removed from Fifth Avenue outside of Central Park at 103. So here I come, I'm a finalist. I come up with what I think is a winning idea. I show up at finals and the other 3 people don't. The community took that as offensive. If you should do public art, you really should show up at the finals, particularly if the community is present, because the community feels like they should be respected, and rightly so. And so long story short, the selection committee picked another artist and the community had a temper tantrum about it. I mean, screaming, crying, cursing, falling in each other's arms. This went on for an hour. And of course, this created tremendous flurry in the art world because nothing like that had ever really happened to that degree. Of course, now we got, our phones and video and things like that. The artist stepped down, which was very noble. The Cultural Affairs Commissioner quit his job. City Council stood on the front of New York City Hall and announced that they were calling out City of New York Percent for Art program for bias and abuse of power. And that hasn't happened either. So needless to say, the media was like, whoa. And so all of a sudden, the big question is, who is Vinnie Bagwell? So that was the beginning of an adventure. For those of you who are not familiar with this whole story, this is the island of Manhattan, that big green square on the left, that's Central Park. And this kind of tells you what's in the vicinity of the site where the sculpture is supposed to go. So I'm just going to go through my inspirations. Up the street at 109, now mind you, my installation site is 103. Up at 109, there is the entrance to the Conservancy Gardens. Now, the killer is, I know Central Park. I have walked around Central Park a number of years, keyword, around Central Park. I never really walked all through Central Park, so I didn't know that the Conservancy Gardens was there. Jaw-dropping beauty. It's like, oh my God, I know that was there. I wish that's gorgeous. But the gate, I'm looking at the gate. Now, where the J. Marion Sims sculpture was, there is a giant plinth that I don't like. And I'm like, can I move that? And they're like, yes, you may. It's like, is there a hole in the wall where that is? It's like, yes, there is. So the question is, what are you going to put a hole in the wall? So I'm thinking this gate to me looks very masculine, mostly because it's rectangles. I'm like, women are curvy and organic. I want to create a sister gate to this. And of course, across the street is the New York Academy of Medicine and the New York Museum. So I'm trying to take all these things and tie it into my concept. And one of the things that dawned on me is that, in art, well, back up. Sometimes I name my public artworks before I actually create them. So the big question was, what am I going to make? I'm like, I don't know. You're at the very beginning of conception. When you don't know anything, you just got a bunch of chaos in your head and you're trying to settle on something. So one day I was like, well, why don't we just name it first? So I was like, well, let's name it a V name, like Vinnie. So victory. So I Googled the meaning of victory. And of course, one of the things it said that victories are one of the choirs of angels. There are 7 different choirs of angels. So of course, they've got archangels, guardian angels. Victories are the ones that receive you from the guardians who've been with you the whole trip. And they're the ones that take you back to God, the light, or whatever you believe. And I'm like, I like that idea. I like that idea. And so as I began Googling angels in public art, there's no Black angels in public art. I mean, if you find them, please send it to me. But the point of it is that I'm looking like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean there's no Black people in heaven? What does that mean? And so that's it. I'm doing it. I'm doing an angel. That's it. I'm doing an angel because New York is known for diversity. And if there are none, we should have one. So that's how I settled on that. So here is the site. That's the old plinth. And this is Fifth Avenue. The sidewalk on Fifth Avenue is 30 feet deep. Coincidentally, it's at an intersection, and the intersection is 30 feet wide. So when they called and told me, say hi, sit down. When they called and told me that I had become a finalist, they asked me if I had any questions, and I had already thought about it. And I said, I'd like to know if I could have a footprint, 30 by 30. And they said, yes. I said, okay, great. I said, I want to create a sanctuary. I want to create a room so that when you're walking up or down Fifth Avenue and you hit this space, you've arrived in a space, creating a destination. So of course, this is again showing you the elevation and the width of the sidewalk. And so again, I came up with a psychology and I'm like, this is a guide for souls. And her goal is to enlighten. And I had asked the city, is it possible to use live fire? They said yes. Of course, now we're having second thoughts. Well, no, excuse me. They're having second thoughts about live fire because the concern is about safety and a bunch of other things. And stay tuned about the fire. Again, there's something called the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors take an oath to do no harm. There actually is a clause in that oath that says you will not do harm to women and children. This is a sculpture to remind everybody, first, do no harm. So it's an unfolding story. So as usual, I've got a figure of an angel, and there's bas-relief that goes all the way around it. And one of the things that I really wanted to show about women is how women support each other. How, example, if something happened to you at the doctor today and you got hurt in the process, and let's just say you were really upset about it, you would call your mother, your sister, your cousin, your girlfriend. Everybody would rally around you to make sure you're okay. And so I wanted to talk about sisterhood and the meaning of being a woman among women. And so this shows you all sides. And again, the goal was so that no matter what side you're looking at, you're going to see 12 women. This is the pedestal and the elevation. And this is the whole idea. Behind that wall, there actually is a tree, but it blooms yellow. We wanted a tree that blooms pink. And again, the idea was pink for women in the spring, and the rest of the year when the blooms are gone, it will have like blood red leaves. As you can see, I've got my beautiful, very feminine looking gate. And I don't know, I love this idea. At any rate, again, we're talking about a plum tree that'll bloom pink to celebrate women. And evidently there are flowering trees on Fifth Avenue, but not in this vicinity. So this is the overview. And again, this is my 30 by 30 footprint. And again, the whole idea is about universal life and having a living democracy. And we're all talking like this now. You know, I was talking about this about a year ago, but now it's like, no, we're all talking about, you know, racial democracy, a living democracy. Let's walk the walk. This is night lighting. And again, this is dramatic and exciting. The sacred place of my ancestors. So last fall, I get a phone call from a very old friend who lives in Montgomery, New York. And she's telling me that there's an African burial ground up there and they're interested in having public art. So I take a ride. Turns out to be the second largest African burial ground in New York State. You see all those stakes? Everywhere you see a stake, there's a body. There's 171 of them. The background information is very vague, very scarce. I've got several historians right now researching so I can tell a coherent story, because right now I only have pieces. This is located on Route 416 near Interstate 84 on the side of the road. You see where the car is? That's the side of the road. And so this kind of gives you an idea of where it is relative to the actual town of Montgomery. And you see where 84 kind of runs by it, not far. And this is the actual site plan. So because of the misadventures of the African burial ground in New York City, I knew that I was going to have to do a lot more due diligence. And of course, here we are really like 25 years later, we have technology. And so I called the United States Department of Agriculture, and first thing out my mouth was like, I need you to do something for me. I'm gonna need an in-kind service. Let me tell you what I want. And so I asked for a ground penetrating survey. And basically that's kind of like a sonogram that lets you know what's in the ground. Now, the interesting thing about New York State, and it's funny how you learn archaeological terminology and things like that, New York State is glacial rock, which makes it more difficult to discern, well, rock versus bones versus whatever the case may be. And so it was interesting because now we have to go the next step. So we need, well, we have the Gpr survey, but now we need a GIS and a GPS, and there's all these different kinds of technological surveys you can do to plot where these remains are. The interesting thing about that is that my neighbor is an archaeologist. He's like the next door down. And turns out he's the who's who archaeologist for the Western Hemisphere. So he's been on every major dig on this side of the planet, for real. And, you know, one of the things that he applauded with my process, he says, normally nobody bothers to do all that. He says, the fact that you're getting all of the surveys done and you're compiling them and you're overlapping them and you're really, really doing your due diligence, you're setting a standard for how burial grounds should be done. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I want. I don't want to hear no noise when I'm finished. I want to make sure that I've done this properly. And my prime goal is to be respectful. But in the process of being respectful, it's about preservation of this space. Right now, it's pristine, it's virgin. And we kind of want to keep it that way, but we also want people to be able to experience it. And so we're still waiting for the rest of the information to come back to find out, you know, is it okay to create a, what we call a controlled path so that people can walk, let's just say around the perimeter of it and kind of experience it. Because the interesting thing about the woods in New York, unlike, I'll just say places down south, the ground is clean. Like we don't have a whole lot of underbrush. So you can literally walk through the woods and not need a machete. And so we want people to be able to engage the space. You know, when you're talking to the federal government, they call it passive recreation. It's like, okay, you know, we want people to visit. But again, we don't want people running all over the ground because that creates erosion. And so the goal is to create a handicap accessible way for people to experience this space. And so I'm very excited about it. What's really interesting about public art now is that when I look for calls, there are also usually notices that says that we're giving particular attention to women and people of color. So should not be a problem getting this particular project completed. And again, this is one of those instances where we're starting from zero. Oftentimes when you're in public art, you're competing and the money is already allocated. And when you win, you just kind of hit the ground running and making the artwork. In this instance, we're starting from true conception as well as developing as we go. So for instance, today we were talking about, as I mentioned earlier, Cdbg funding from HUD. And because the demographic is different, can't get the funding for the same thing. But for instance, one of the things that this particular area is eligible for is ADA compliant construction. So that's helpful because a lot of what we want to do is going to be falling under ADA. So I'm excited about that. Just so you know, this is what a GPR survey looks like. And if you're not an archaeologist, you're like, what does that mean? We got ours back and we all were like, I'm looking at it, but I don't know what I'm looking at. What does it mean? I mean, what part of that is the body? How do I know what any of this is? And you need an archaeologist to read this. And so even though they gave us a very nice report, none of us understood it. So we're waiting for the archaeologist to give us a regular report in plain English so we can understand exactly what did you find? Exactly what does it mean? And do we have enough information to suit our purpose? Because our purpose is to design and not disturb anybody's peace. This is the goal. So as I said, we're very excited about this, and stay tuned as the world turns. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vinnie. You did it. Stop sharing. Good stuff. That was excellent. I'm going to say thank you to Vinnie. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for helping us start off our Black History Month programming, and for sharing your work with us and for sharing your stories. We will have this presentation available in the virtual library. I will let people know when it's available. Messages are still coming in, people saying thank you. And thank you all for attending, for coming tonight, and we'll see you all again soon. Good night.
Pleasure. Good night.